This is an episode that goes back to my brief period as a literary success and my author's career at its peak, even though I didn't realize it at the time. I thought it was onward and upward during those months. But we learn these things gradually as life progresses, and we learn what's important and what isn't. And I'm starting to see that even that wasn't nearly as important as I thought at the time. But my second novel, Zazoo, had come out several months earlier to considerable acclaim compared to my first novel, which had sunk like a fast sinking stone and not left a ripple behind. Zazoo, however, had garnered some good reviews in the reviewing journals, even gotten starred reviews from various places, and seemed to have possibilities. It had buzz, as they said in the industry. It had possibilities of even winning a major literary prize in that category for children's novels. So I was buoyant. I was eager to talk about what it was to be an author and how my life as an author related to this novel I had written that I was still pleased with. I liked it. I was happy to read from it. I was happy to talk about it with people who were interested. Now, the people who were most interested were librarians and some school teachers. So I made a number of school appearances in Minneapolis and St. Paul schools and the environs, and over in Wisconsin, which is where I found myself this one morning in late 2001, a couple of months after my book came out. I was standing in the front of a 7th grade classroom looking at these very silent, fairly sullen seeming students in this one class. They had nothing to say. They had nothing to ask. They seemed to have no curiosity about this man who had driven over from Minneapolis to talk to them, this author. As their teacher had written on the blackboard, Richard Mosier, author of Zazoo, which they had read, presumably. They were to have read it by the time I got there, but it struck me that the air didn't have that expectant feel of people who had read my book and were eager to explore it and ask me about it. Eagerness was missing from that room. Eagerness was missing from the teacher who had introduced me and now stood in the back of the room with her arms crossed over her chest, watching the students as if to find one who was transgressing in some way so that the student could be reproved. She didn't cast me that look, but I was half expecting it. I had been one of those transgressors at that age, and I was familiar with that teacher's look. I had a feeling with this lack of eagerness I was sensing that this teacher might not have liked my novel as well as Kirkus Reviews had liked it, or Publishers Weekly. She might herself have been commanded to have her students be commanded in turn to read this book. I looked from face to face. Mostly their focus was down or to the side. They weren't looking back at me, too many of them, or some were looking at me with a kind of curiosity. You might look at someone who had been in an accident to see if they were still squirming or still alive. And I was still alive, just barely, but I was revived partly when a little girl in the front, a plump girl in the front row, raised one arm. I said, "Yes, right here in front. You have a question you'd like to ask?" To which she looking down at her notes, said laboriously, "Mr. Mosier, what inspired you to write Zazoo?" Oh, this was a question that always froze me because it indicated it had come from their teacher. She had written it on the blackboard. They would copy them out on their pieces of paper. And now this poor girl was reading the question out to me. It was not a living thing, this question. It was a dead little fish that had been passed along from hand to hand. She didn't particularly want to touch it. I looked around the other students and I said, that really isn't the way it works. Not for me. It's just a lot of hard work, a lot of writing it out again, making corrections, reading it out loud to myself to see how it reads, trying out different rhythms and structures to see what works best. I'm sure you talk about that in class from time to time. Well, I wasn't sure of this, and I didn't see any confirmation of this brave claim on their faces or in their body language. I certainly didn't see it from their teacher standing in back. I was starting to get the impression now that not only did she not particularly care for my novel, maybe she didn't like the process of writing. Maybe she had never learned to revise in her student days. But I decided I'd forge on ahead. I had 40 minutes to fill before their lunch hour, as I'd learned. This was the last block of time they had in the morning before they could go to the cafeteria and eat their lunch and loosen up a little and talk with each other about things that were fun. So I said, well, look, kids, I'll tell you a story about how my life was going when I started writing this novel, Zazoo. And crucially, I'll tell you some about the last several years before I started writing it, because those are important to understanding where this novel came from in my mind. So several years before I started writing it, let's see now, it would have been 6 or 7 years ago now, I was at a very low ebb in my life, a very low point. I'd had my heart broken by a woman not so long before, several years before this. I was still recovering from that. And I was living by myself in a small apartment in Minneapolis. I had no work. I had a stack of novels I'd written in my life that were not published. I was a failure as a writer, as all sorts of things, it felt like, in my life. And on top of all this, my father in North Carolina was dying. He was very sick. I thought about him a lot. And that was one of the major things going on in my life, was my sadness having to do with my old father, whose memory had gone away and left him unable to communicate with the world he'd been so articulate in conversing with during his productive years. So that made me very sad. Now, as I looked around at the children in the class, I could see that some of them were somewhat engaged and were leaning forward a little. They weren't slouched back in their seats, all of them, as they had been, and as many still were, but some now were listening, because here was sadness to be discussed, someone else's sadness. They were there now, they were alive, and maybe they'd even forgotten about lunch coming up, just for a few minutes. I went on, well, my life consisted mostly, during this sad period of thinking about my father, of staying up late at night, listening to the Minneapolis jazz station on the radio, playing softly in the kitchen of this apartment, which was a nice big kitchen and had a good square writing table in the middle of the kitchen. That was where I spent most of my time. I'd make cups of tea, I'd sit there, sip my tea, listen to the music, think about my father. And the one thing I was capable of doing, of producing in those days, was a few poems. I didn't seem capable of starting some long project. Even a short story was too long for me in those days. But a poem, most of them having to do with my father, a poem I was capable of, because I could write one of those in a day or two. I could write a line or two at a time. And that was the most energy I had with my melancholy in those days, the most I was able to manage. That was my life. Except occasionally I would venture out and I would go on walks around the city of Minneapolis. Those of you who've been there to visit may know Minneapolis has quite a few beautiful lakes, and it has walking trails around the lakes. These are mostly in fairly affluent neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods with big houses, but they allow people who don't have money to walk around the lakes. Everyone is entitled to walking around the lakes there, even if they can't afford to buy one of these big houses set back from the lakes. There'll be the lake with the walking trail alongside it, and then the street, and then the houses of all the millionaires back behind on the other side. So one day I was walking along a lake called Lake of the Isles, which is a very interesting lake because it isn't just a round, super big puddle. It's got bays in and out and two islands out in the middle that just have trees on them. It was late fall, as it is now. Back then, the cold weather was starting to come in. But I was warm. I was walking slowly around this one lake. I wasn't envying the rich people who lived in the houses because their fathers might have been dying too. You know, this is a human condition that we all have to deal with, the illness and death of loved ones. It comes to all of us. So I wasn't feeling cast out because I didn't have any $1-million home or anything. And I wasn't feeling particularly cast out because I was unpublished. But you're not unpublished, said one girl in the back. You're not unpublished. You got this book that's published. To which her teacher in the back said, Jade, be careful. You're going to be polite to this author who's visiting us today. Which made me more interested. So Jade was a troublemaker in the class. Finally, I located her. She was a girl in the back row with black hair. Appeared to have been dyed black. It was super black. And not quite as black eyebrows, but a fierce look. And though I couldn't see any tattoo on her anywhere visible, I could tell that she wanted to have tattoos. She was a troublemaker. And I was glad she was there because she could liven things up. What was it she had said, well, I wasn't published yet, I said. I'm published now, but I wasn't published in those days. So I was entitled to be as miserable as I wanted to be if I felt like being miserable, because I was then completely unpublished. And I was completely unloved, it felt to me. I was completely unemployed. What I did have was a roof over my head, a warm place to sleep and brood and write my poems about my father. So I was walking around this lake, looking here and there. Then I decided I would walk not in the path that was closest to the water, but across the street on the sidewalk that was empty of all other people, because I didn't want to see other people. I wasn't in a mood to pass other people on this path. On the sidewalk that was on the other side of the street, no one was walking there because they could walk over here by this beautiful lake. So I crossed the street and I was walking along this sidewalk, and I'd glance into the yards of the wealthy people who owned these big houses. I would admire the hedges that had been also neatly trimmed by people they paid to trim their hedges. And then I saw something that stopped me because it had nothing to do with anyone there. It was quite independent. It was a gray cat. It was walking across one of the lawns and was completely indifferent seeming to me, to the cold gray clouds, to the trees that were losing all their leaves that were drifting onto the ground, or to the millionaires who lived on beyond it. It was just walking on its own, its shoulders moving elegantly as it walked, and its tail slowly wafting back and forth behind it. It was such an elegant creature and seemed so pleased with itself and self-contained. It didn't need anything. Just a gray cat on its own walking across this beautiful cloudy afternoon in autumn. It knew I was watching. It didn't care. It was unhurried. It walked on across this lawn and then disappeared into a hedge and was gone. But I'd seen it, and it had made me feel good to see this independent spirit out there in the world, where I had had a feeling just a few moments before that there was nothing but sorrow and sadness, because that was what I was consumed with myself. I thought, well, I'm going to go walk by the lake again. Go feel the soothing influence of all this water being nearby, because I'd learned that being near water was a very pacifying thing for me, which is why I'd gone for this walk in the first place. I crossed the street, went back on the trail, but I was still thinking about that gray cat I had just seen. And I thought, well, now, how would I say that in French? The gray cat. You're 12. I was 15, going on 16, the year I was in France. I spent a year there in school. And I had learned to speak fairly good French. I wasn't fluent, but I'd learned fairly good French, and I could say what I wanted to say, in most simple things I could say. And I knew that the gray cat in French would be le chat gris, because they reverse the order of adjectives and nouns in French. The gray cat. The more I thought about the cat, I thought that he wasn't sad exactly, but he had a certain quiet melancholy. Of course, this was influenced by my own mood, but I decided that that cat was, maybe he was a little sad after all. He was melancholy. He was lonesome. And yet he was still pleased at his ability to walk anywhere he wished out in the wide world. And then another word came to me that was perhaps prompted by these first two words, le chat gris, which was chagrin, which has nothing to do with cats in itself. It's a noun, chagrin, which means a kind of sadness, a kind of quiet sadness in French. And so if you combine the two words, then the word and the phrase, you would come up with le chagrin du chat gris, the melancholy sadness of the gray cat, the sad gray cat. And I loved that phrase. I walked on around the lake, repeating it to myself, like I was a small child who had found alongside a stream a pebble that he particularly liked, and he would turn it over, maybe a gray pebble. He would turn it over in his fingers and admire its shape and rub it until it was dry and see how glossy it was and admire its wonderful form and warm it up in his hands and look at it again, this nice, perfect, rounded pebble. And in my mind, this phrase I had come up with was that kind of perfect souvenir that you could polish and feel and put in your pocket and carry around and forget about, and then realize it was there and remember it, take it out and admire it again. Le chagrin du chagrin. This is something writers very much like to do. Find words in just their perfect magic combination for representing a mood or an atmosphere which otherwise they might have been unable to come up with a description, combination of words for. So I walked on around the lake. Le chagrin du chagrin. Le chagrin du chagrin. Write it for us, said that same girl in back. Jade, said her teacher, you could say please. Jade didn't say please. She had ordered me to write Le chagrin du chagrin on the blackboard. I was happy to oblige her. Our time was slipping away like quicksilver. It was fine. Everything was going great. I turned and I wrote Le chagrin du chagrin. You have to pronounce it in your throat as if that R is as if you're gargling salt water to help your cold or your sore throat. Le chagrin du chagrin. I could see a few of them trying to gargle in their seats, but not too many. Maybe they thought I was loony. Who cared? It was fine. They were listening. I was talking about writing, which made me happy, and they could do as they pleased. It was only another half hour or so now until their lunchtime. So I put this phrase away in my mind, I said, just like a child putting the pebble away in his pants pocket and knowing he had access to it if he wanted to touch it and admire it, but maybe forgetting all about it, maybe finding it in his pants pocket weeks later and taking it out to his great delight. It was there. I knew it would stay there. I knew I would not forget this particular phrase. So my life continued. I went back to my sad apartment. I wrote my sad poems. I thought about my father. And eventually, as time passed, I did get a job. I didn't go out looking for it, but a friend arranged a job because she was concerned about me. And it turned out to be a good job for me, which was driving children to their nursery school every day. As it happened, this nursery school was in that same wealthy part of town that this lake, the Lake of the Isles, was in, same part of Minneapolis. And some of those children lived along Lake of the Isles and some of the other lakes in the area. And then there were some black children in the school. There's one Muslim brother and sister who lived across Lyndale in the less wealthy part of Minneapolis. It was a good job for me. For one thing, it wasn't too many hours. I would drive them all to school early in the morning, and then I was free for a while to walk around the lakes or go swimming at the YMCA, drive a new set of children to school, and then have a break, and then later on in the afternoon, I'd drive those kids home. So the years passed. My father died. It was very sad when he died, but it was a relief to us all to have his suffering over. And I met a woman at a reading, funny enough, at a literary reading at a bookstore. And we got to be friends. We got to be good friends, and we fell in love. We decided we should actually get married, which was an astonishment to me. I'd never been married. Here I was in my 40s. I'd never been married. I had assumed that my chances of ever marrying were about as good as my chances of ever being published. We decided we would get married the next summer. Along about that same time, one day, the phone rang, and it was a woman's voice calling from New York City, she said. She said, "Is this Richard Mosier?" And I said, "Yes, it is." I was thinking maybe I owed someone some money or something that I'd forgotten about. Why was someone calling me? I'm calling from New York City from Philomel Books, and we're interested in possibly publishing your novel, The Taxi Navigator. I had sent out this novel again. It had been rejected 40 times back in the 1980s when I'd written it. And now a friend in Minneapolis had suggested I send it out again. So I'd sent it to 25 more places. They'd all been saying no. But here a woman was saying, maybe, yes. And in fact, they did say yes at Philomel Books. They decided to publish my novel, The Taxi Navigator. So this was a huge change in my life. It was a small contract for a small amount of money. That didn't matter to me. It was that my essence as a writer was being acknowledged by someone out there in the wide world, someone I'd never met, someone who knew me only through having read my story. So it was a magic year for me, 1996. In August, I was married, and in September, I think it was, my book came out. I had a real book I could hold in my hands that I had written myself, and someone else had decided to take a chance on and publish. So our life settled into a new routine. Now it wasn't just my life, it was our life. I was married, we lived together, we ate and discussed things together. It was a wonderful change in my experience. It was so much richer all of a sudden, my life. And there were people calling up every now and then who wanted me to come talk to a group of students about my book. I was recognized for what I was. Now, maybe it was on a small scale, but that didn't matter so much. It was like a seed that has been long neglected, long in the earth, and suddenly it sends up a shoot and there's a blossom, and everyone is amazed because they hadn't realized there was any flower possible in that spot. But here I was with the book out, and that was my flowering. It was a wonderful moment in my life. So that was my condition when this phrase came back to me. These several years later, several long years after I'd been walking around Lake of the Isles. One morning, I was lying in bed alongside my wife. She was asleep. I was trying not to wake her. I was thinking various thoughts. I was looking up at the ceiling fan on the ceiling over our bed. Just a little daylight was creeping in through the blinds. Gray winter light, as dawn came on, became lighter and lighter. And something about the grayness of the light reminded me of that gray cat I'd seen across from Lake of the Isles those years earlier. Le chagrin du chagrin. That was what So this phrase came back to me and I started playing with it. And then for some reason, I didn't use that phrase, but I started putting together a little poem in my head, a little poem in French, in my simple schoolboy French. Tell us the poem, said Jade in back. I'd behaved as she wanted me to when she told me to write down that one phrase. Now she wanted to hear the poem. And I said, well, I don't know that I can remember it really. That was a long time ago. I can remember just how it started. Tell us, she said. Please. Now I knew she was really trying, because she wasn't one to say please to adults very often. I knew that about her from when I'd been her age. I said, well, since you ask so nicely, I'll see what I can do. Let's see. It started, Il y avait un chat au bord du canal qui n'était ni content ni triste. So, there once was a cat down by the canal who wasn't sad and wasn't happy. This is very much like that poem that runs through this novel of Zazoo, come to think of it. Isn't it, Jade? She said, well, yes, in a tone that let me know that she hadn't read the book. But she wished all at once that she had read it. She would have liked to have pleased me by being able to say she had read my novel and was familiar with the poem in it, which was, in fact, about a sad gray cat. But she hadn't, and now she had regret that she hadn't read it. And I said, well, you'll have to refresh your memory about it a little bit. That's fine. But it's in there. I was lying in bed, and I came up with these 10 lines or so in French. Il voulait voyager. No, how'd it go? Not that. Il voulait bien nager, mais il détestait l'eau. Il voulait voyager, mais il manquait le pot pour quitter sa proprement sèche maison. On and on like that. So I had a few lines and they were rhyming. I liked them. It was fun playing with them, but I knew I was going to forget them if I didn't write them down. So I crept from bed as quietly as I could so as not to wake my wife, went into the kitchen, and I sat down there and I started writing down these lines with a pencil on a piece of paper. When I had them written down, I knew I was on my way towards writing something big again, another novel. I knew it was starting in the recesses of my mind. It was as if this little playful poem coming to me wasn't going to be in the novel necessarily, but the impulse to get it out and into the world and onto a piece of paper was an indication to me that down deeper, I wanted to work on this project. I wanted to see where this gray cat would take me in a story. And so that pleased me very much because I knew I was on my way with this new project. What was your new novel going to be about? Said the girl in front who had asked the first question, the question about inspiration, but now wasn't reading from notes. To which I said, well, you all know perfectly well what it's about, this novel, because you've all read it, haven't you? And now they laughed because they knew I knew they hadn't read it. And they knew I suspected, some few of them, that they were now going to make a point of reading it, just because they were curious about it, finally, because I had engaged them in it. I hadn't talked blandly about inspiration or something, but I'd let them into my life somewhat. And so that's how my novel, Zazoo, was inspired. It wasn't, but that's how it came about, through a sad gray cat.